What if the seeds of tyranny aren't born in power but in pain? To truly understand Queen Mary, I mean no to history as Bloody Mary, we have to rewind the story. Not to her first year as queen, not to the burnings, but to the nursery, to a time when Mary Tudor wasn't feared, she was adored. Born in 1516, Mary was the only surviving child of King Henry VIII and Queen Catherine of Aragon, a royal daughter, a precious heir, and the apple of her father's eye, at least for a while. From the moment she could speak, Mary was surrounded by tutors, musicians, scholars. She was exceptionally intelligent, fluent in Latin by the age of 9, and musically gifted. Her early life was filled with the splendor of court and the certainty of privilege. She was meant to be queen one day, not in her own right but beside a husband, a king consort. But everything changed because of one thing: her mother couldn't give Henry a son. Henry VIII was obsessed with a male heir. The Tudor dynasty was young, and in a time of political instability, a woman ruling alone was considered unthinkable. Catherine, despite her devotion, had failed to produce a surviving son, and so Henry began to search for a new solution: annul the marriage. What followed was nothing short of chaos. Henry's desire to remarry led to the infamous break from the Catholic Church. The Pope refused to annul the marriage, so Henry declared himself head of the Church of England. The nation split in two, and Mary, she became collateral damage. Declared illegitimate by her own father, stripped of her royal title, her household was dismantled. Her mother, her anchor in life, was sent away to die alone in exile. Mary was forced to serve as a lady-in-waiting to her younger half-sister Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Henry's new wife. Imagine that. Once the future Queen of England, now relegated to a servant in her own home, watching the woman who replaced her mother walk the halls in triumph, watching her mother's name erased from court history, enduring emotional abuse and political manipulation from every side. Mary's world didn't just fall apart, it shattered, but it did something else too. It hardened her. She became intensely religious, clinging to the Catholic faith that her father had abandoned. Her mother had been Spanish royalty and a devout Catholic. For Mary, religion wasn't just belief, it was identity, it was loyalty, it was justice. She believed she had been wronged not just by Henry, but by England itself, for turning its back on God. She waited, year after year, as Henry married again and again, executing wives, producing new children, and further entrenching Protestant reforms. She watched as her country transformed, churches defaced, Latin masses banned, monasteries dissolved. And still, she believed. She believed that one day she would restore what had been broken, not just for her mother, not just for herself, but for God. This wasn't just ambition, it was trauma, the kind that shapes every decision you make. When Mary eventually came to power in 1553, after the deaths of her father, her brother Edward VI, and the failed attempt to install Lady Jane Grey, it wasn't just political victory, it was vindication, it was spiritual. She had survived everything: her father's betrayal, her mother's death, exile, humiliation. And now she was queen. In her eyes, God had chosen her. She wasn't just ruling England, she was saving it. But this triumph came with a cost. Mary had been so profoundly shaped by loss and injustice that she saw opposition not as disagreement but as betrayal. She didn't just see Protestants as rivals, they were heretics, enemies of God, people like the ones who had torn her family apart. Her policies, her paranoia, and even her persecutions all stemmed from this place, a life defined by betrayal and loneliness. It's important to understand this psychological blueprint because without it, Mary's reign makes little sense. She didn't just want to restore Catholicism, she needed to. Her identity, her purpose, her entire sense of justice demanded it. Mary's trauma wasn't just personal, it was national, and she carried that burden into every council meeting, every royal decree, every execution order. She had been taught that suffering leads to salvation, and now she was in power, she would enforce that lesson with fire. But power didn't heal her, it didn't bring peace. Because you can't fix trauma by becoming the thing you once feared. Mary ruled England like a woman who had been wronged by history and needed to correct it, but in doing so she became a figure history would remember not with sympathy but with terror. And that's the tragedy. Because behind Bloody Mary was once just Mary, A bright child, a loyal daughter, a girl who loved music, languages, and her mother, a girl who was broken by politics and forged into a weapon by betrayal. Her story didn't begin in blood, it began in pain, and understanding that changes everything. When we hear the name Bloody Mary, an image flashes before us: burning stakes, screaming martyrs, and a queen whose heart is colder than the steel of her executioner's axe. The Protestant propaganda machine has done its job well. For centuries, Mary Tudor has been synonymous with religious cruelty, with zealotry gone mad. But what if her violence wasn't born out of sadism, but out of sincere, desperate belief? To understand the burnings of Mary's reign, we have to step inside her mind, a place not of malice, but of conviction. Mary didn't think she was murdering heretics. She thought she was saving souls. The England that Mary inherited in 1553 was religiously fractured. After decades of reform under her father Henry VIII and her brother Edward VI, the country had shifted towards Protestantism. New forms of worship, new doctrines, and a growing contempt for the old ways had taken root. Latin Mass was gone, the Pope's authority dismissed, Catholic rituals mocked. For Mary, this wasn't progress, it was blasphemy. She had been raised on the belief that the Catholic Church was the one true faith. The Church of Rome wasn't just religious, it was sacred, eternal, divine. To break from it wasn't just rebellion, it was sin. So when she took the throne, Mary didn't see herself as a tyrant, she saw herself as a redeemer, chosen by God, destined to heal her country's soul. And for her, healing meant returning England to the Catholic fold. At first, her approach was measured. She asked Parliament to repeal Protestant laws, she restored papal authority, she revived the Heresy Acts, which made it a capital offense to deny core Catholic doctrines, and when Protestants resisted, she didn't hesitate. The burnings began in 1555. Over the next 3 years, nearly 280 Protestants were executed by fire, publicly, deliberately. Mary wasn't hiding what she was doing, she wanted England to watch, to see the cost of heresy, to feel the fear. But what history often omits is that Mary didn't invent this strategy. Religious executions were the norm across Europe. Protestants burned Catholics in Geneva. Catholics burned Protestants in Spain and France. This was the 16th century, and in the 16th century, to defy religious orthodoxy was to risk death. Mary believed that allowing heresy to spread was spiritual negligence. Every soul led astray was a failure of her duty as queen. She saw herself as England's spiritual mother, and like a mother, she believed discipline was necessary. Think of it like this: if you believed, truly deeply believed, that rejecting a certain faith would condemn someone to eternal damnation, what would you do? Would you plead? Would you threaten? Would you punish? Mary's answer was yes to all three. She pleaded with Protestants to recant. Some did, they were spared. Others stood firm, they became martyrs. The most famous of these was Thomas Cranmer, the former Archbishop of Canterbury. Once a powerful figure under Henry VIII and Edward VI, Cranmer had helped build the Protestant Church of England. Under Mary, he was arrested and sentenced to death. He then recanted his recantation, and on the day of his execution, he thrust the hand that had signed his recantation into the flames first, declaring it unworthy. Mary watched as the flames devoured him. To her, Cranmer's death was justice. He had led England into sin, his writings had poisoned minds, his execution was not personal, it was divine. But to the people, to the Protestants watching, it was horror, and that horror spread. Writers like John Foxy seized on these stories. In exile during Mary's reign, Foxy compiled tales of those burned under her rule. His book, Acts and Monuments, published in 1563, painted Mary as a bloodthirsty fanatic. Foxy's martyrs were heroes. Mary was the villain. And his book was everywhere. Endorsed by Queen Elizabeth I, Fox's Book of Martyrs was placed in every church, read by every schoolchild, quoted from every pulpit. It became one of the most influential works in English history. But it wasn't history, it was propaganda. That's not to say the burnings weren't real. They were. They were brutal, horrifying, and morally indefensible by today's standards. But they weren't the actions of a mad woman. They were the actions of a woman who believed she was saving her country's soul. Mary didn't burn people because she enjoyed it. She did it because she believed the fires could purify, that the smoke rising into the sky carried England's sins away, that fear would bring repentance, and repentance would bring salvation. She wasn't alone in this thinking. Her advisors, her bishops, even ordinary citizens supported the executions at first, but as the fires continued, public support waned. The horror began to outweigh the fear. Mary's vision of redemption was crumbling under the weight of ash. By the end of her reign, even some Catholics were uneasy. The burnings hadn't united England, they had divided it further. Instead of healing the nation, they had scorched its conscience. Mary saw it. She prayed more, became more isolated, her health deteriorated, but she never recanted, never apologized. She went to her death believing she had done the right thing. And maybe that's what makes her story so haunting. She wasn't evil, she was devout. She wasn't cruel, she was convinced. Mary Tudor lit the fires of Smithfield not with hatred, but with hope. And in doing so, she became the very thing she feared most, a queen remembered not for salvation, but for suffering. But behind the smoke and screams there was always a deeper truth. A woman who thought she was saving her people, and who paid the ultimate price for believing too much. That's not the story we're taught, but maybe it's the one we need to hear. When Mary Tudor decided to marry Philip II of Spain, it wasn't just a political move, it was a national crisis. The idea of marrying into the powerful Spanish Habsburg dynasty sent shockwaves through England. To Mary, the marriage was a way to secure her dynasty, reinforce her Catholic mission, and find personal companionship, but to her subjects, it felt like betrayal, and the fallout from that union would define much of her short reign. Let's rewind to the early 1550s. Mary was on the throne, but she was 37 years old, unmarried, and under immense pressure to produce an heir. The urgency wasn't just personal, it was political. Without a child, Mary's Protestant half-sister Elizabeth would be next in line, threatening to undo everything Mary had fought for. The solution? A strong Catholic husband. Philip of Spain seemed like the perfect candidate. He was the son of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and a devout Catholic with control over a vast empire. To Mary, he was God's instrument, a man who would help her restore England to Catholic glory. But this alliance, forged in religion and royal bloodlines, quickly turned sour in the court of public opinion. To many English subjects, especially Protestant nobles, Philip was a terrifying figure. He represented foreign influence, Spanish authoritarianism, and the dreaded Inquisition. People whispered that Spanish troops would soon walk English streets, that English gold would fund Spanish wars, and that Mary's marriage would reduce England to a satellite of the Spanish Empire. Despite Parliament's reservations and widespread public unease, Mary pressed forward. The marriage treaty attempted to soothe fears. Philip would have the title of king, but no real power. England wouldn't be dragged into Spain's wars, no Spaniards would hold English office. If Mary died first, Philip would have no claim to the throne. On paper, it looked like a fair compromise. But perception is everything, and the damage was already done. The backlash was immediate and explosive. In early 1554, Sir Thomas Wyatt led a rebellion, rallying over 3,000 men in Kent. Officially, their goal was to stop the Spanish marriage. But beneath that lay a deeper fear. The erosion of English sovereignty, the suppression of Protestantism, and the looming shadow of Spanish domination. The Wyatt Rebellion almost succeeded. The rebels marched toward London, gaining supporters along the way. Key towns fell, even some nobles hesitated to oppose them. For a moment, it looked like Mary's rule could collapse. But Mary wasn't a timid woman. She responded with remarkable strength. As panic gripped London, she addressed the people at Guildhall, delivering a defiant speech that emphasized loyalty, treason, and her divine right to rule. She spoke not just as a queen, but as an Englishwoman. Her words struck a chord. The city rallied. The rebellion was crushed. Mary's retaliation was swift and brutal. Wyatt was executed, along with over 100 of his followers, and tragically, Mary ordered the execution of Lady Jane Grey, the teenage girl who had once been proclaimed queen in her place. Jane had no part in the rebellion, but she remained a symbol, a rallying point for Protestant resistance. To Mary, that was threat enough. The axe fell. This moment marked a turning point in Mary's reign. The Spanish marriage, intended to strengthen her position, had instead exposed deep fractures in the country. It made Mary appear out of touch, foreign-influenced, and dangerously loyal to a power that many of her subjects feared. When Philip finally arrived in England in July 1554, the atmosphere was tense. The wedding, held at Winchester Cathedral, was grand and traditional, but the public's enthusiasm was muted. Philip's aloof demeanor didn't help. He spoke no English, preferred the company of his Spanish courtiers, and showed little interest in English affairs. Worse still, he didn't stay. After just over a year in England, Philip departed for the continent to pursue his own imperial ambitions. Mary, deeply in love and emotionally invested, was devastated. She wrote him letter after letter. She longed for his return, but his affection never matched hers. He returned briefly in 1557, not for love, but to drag England into a war with France. Mary agreed to support him, sending English forces abroad. The result? Disaster. In 1558, England lost Calais, its last territory on the European mainland. It was a crushing blow to national pride. Calais had been in English hands for over 2 centuries. Its fall wasn't just a military loss, it was a humiliation. For Mary it was personal. She was said to have declared, "When I am dead and opened, you shall find Calais lying in my heart." In many ways, the Spanish marriage encapsulated the tragedy of Mary's reign. It began with hope, a powerful alliance, a promise of love, a vision of Catholic rebirth. But it ended in isolation, military failure, and political alienation. Philip never returned to England. He didn't even attend Mary's funeral. The man she had loved, defended, and crowned king beside her had used her for his ambitions and left her to face the consequences alone. And the people didn't forget. The marriage confirmed their fears. Mary had tied England's fate to a foreign empire. She had given her crown, and perhaps her heart, to a man who never truly cared for her or her country. In the years that followed, Protestant writers used the Spanish marriage as further proof of Mary's unfitness to rule. It became part of the Bloody Mary narrative, a queen not only ruthless, but dangerously naive, a woman who mistook devotion for strength, love for loyalty, and power for partnership. Yet in truth, Mary's decision was not driven by malice, but desperation. Desperation for security, for an heir, for divine validation. She had spent her life watching women, her mother, herself, discarded by men with power. Now, as queen, she believed that a husband could complete her reign, make her invincible. Instead, he left her broken. The Spanish marriage didn't doom Mary's legacy alone, but it lit the match. It burned through her popularity, her alliances, and her people's trust. It turned support into suspicion, hope into rebellion. And in the end, it helped create the myth we remember, not of a queen in love or a woman in pain, but of Bloody Mary, the queen who sold England to Spain and ruled through fear. But as we've seen time and again, that myth doesn't tell the full story. Mary Tudor died on November 17, 1558. Just hours later, her half-sister Elizabeth ascended the throne, and with that single transition, the course of English history pivoted dramatically. What followed wasn't just a shift in political leadership, but a calculated rewriting of memory and legacy. Mary's story would no longer be her own. It would be shaped, twisted, and manipulated by Elizabeth and her court into a cautionary tale, a horror story that would magnify Elizabeth's own glory. From the outset, Elizabeth I and her advisors understood one vital truth. To establish the legitimacy of the new Protestant regime, they had to dismantle and discredit everything Mary had stood for. That meant erasing Catholicism's foothold in English politics and casting Mary as a tyrant. And they wasted no time. Elizabeth's reign began with a flurry of legislation aimed at undoing Mary's Catholic reforms. The Act of Supremacy re-established the Church of England with Elizabeth at its head, rejecting papal authority. The Act of Uniformity made Protestant worship mandatory, enforced by fines and penalties. Religious images were removed from churches, Latin Mass was abolished, monasteries were not restored. Mary's dream of a Catholic England, already faltering by the end of her life, was systematic. But laws alone weren't enough. The real weapon was propaganda, and few wielded it more effectively than John Foxey. In 1563, just 5 years after Mary's death, Foxey published Acts and Monuments, better known as Foxey's Book of Martyrs. It was a massive volume filled with vivid, often horrifying stories of Protestants burned at the stake under Mary's rule. Illustrated with woodcuts of flames and agony, the book painted Mary as a religious monster, cruel, unfeeling, and obsessed with death. Foxey's martyrs were noble and brave. Mary was the butcher queen. The book became a fixture in English churches, placed alongside the Bible. Ministers read from it in sermons. Children learned the names of Protestant martyrs in their religious instruction. Its stories were etched into the national memory, not as one version of events, but as truth. And while Foxy had his biases, he was a Protestant exile during Mary's reign, his influence was enormous. His book would be reprinted and expanded for over a century. Elizabeth's court understood that symbols mattered, so Mary's image, already unpopular, was carefully obscured. Her portraits were rarely displayed. When Elizabeth was buried in Westminster Abbey decades later, she was placed in the same tomb as Mary, but the inscription honored only Elizabeth. Mary's name was mentioned in passing, if at all. The monument that could have been Mary's legacy became her erasure. Even art and literature were used to shape the story. Elizabeth was glorified in portraits as the Virgin Queen, regal, radiant, draped in pearls, surrounded by symbols of purity and divine favor. She was presented as the savior of England, the slayer of foreign threats, the bringer of peace. In contrast, Mary's few existing portraits were somber, dark, and unflattering. She was framed as sour-faced, severe, and unlovable. The contrast was intentional. Why did this rewriting work so well? Because Elizabeth offered hope. Her reign brought relative stability after decades of turmoil. Her advisors were politically shrewd. She never married, allowing her to remain unchallenged by a foreign prince, and most importantly, she lived long enough to shape her legacy. 45 years on the throne gave Elizabeth time to build myths. Mary had only 5. The Protestant regime that took root under Elizabeth was eager to use Mary's reign as a moral warning. Don't return to Rome. Don't question the Queen. Don't embrace superstition. The fear of another Bloody Mary kept religious dissent in check for generations. But the consequences of this erasure lasted far beyond Elizabeth's reign. Over centuries, Mary's legacy deteriorated even further. She became the subject of superstition, the ghost in the mirror, the screaming woman soaked in blood. Her real life, the trauma, the love, the political challenges, was forgotten. That's what propaganda does. It simplifies, it distorts, it dehumanizes. Today, historians are re-examining Mary Tudor. Scholars now acknowledge that her burnings, while tragic, were not extraordinary by 16th-century standards. Her political decisions, though harsh, were not irrational, and her devotion to her faith was sincere, not monstrous. But for centuries, she wasn't judged fairly. She was judged by the standards set by her enemies. And those enemies weren't just heretics, they were her successors. Her own sister. It's one of history's cruelest ironies. The woman who fought to preserve her mother's religion was buried beneath the woman whose success depended on its destruction. The queen who believed she had been chosen by God was remembered as a demon, not because of what she did, but because of how power told her story. They say history remembers the winners, but what if it remembers them wrong and forgets the rest entirely? By the time Mary Tudor died in 1558, her name had already begun its transformation, from sovereign to symbol, from woman to warning. And centuries later, what endures most isn't the nuanced story of her reign, but the nickname that clings like a curse, Bloody Mary. But who was she really? To understand Mary, not the legend but the person, we need to strip away the slogans, the slanders, and the simplified history. Because behind the burning pyres and whispered horror stories lies a woman far more tragic and complex than the myth allows. Mary Tudor was not born into infamy. She was born into privilege. The daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, she was a beloved child, brilliant, musically talented, fluent in Latin and French. Her education rivaled that of any prince. She was raised to rule. But her world cracked open when her father cast aside her mother in pursuit of Anne Boleyn and a male heir. Henry's break with Rome shattered Mary's life. Declared illegitimate, forced to renounce her mother's marriage and her own rights, she was reduced from princess to political inconvenience. Her once loving father threatened her with death for refusing to sign documents declaring herself a bastard. And through it all, Mary remained devoted to her mother, to her faith, and to the belief that God would restore what was taken. That faith, unyielding, absolute, became her armor, but it also became her prison. When she finally ascended the throne at 37, she believed it was divine justice. The child cast aside had returned to claim her crown. But ruling wasn't just about legitimacy, it was about legacy. and Mary had one clear mission: to restore the Catholic faith to England, to undo the heresy unleashed by her father and brother, to make her country whole again. But England had changed. The seeds of Protestantism had taken root, and for many it wasn't heresy, it was hope. Mary's efforts to reverse the Reformation weren't seen as healing, but as regression. Her burnings of Protestant heretics, 280 men, women, and even children, were meant as purification. In her eyes, fire was salvation, but to the people watching, it was terror. And terror breeds stories. John Foxy, a Protestant exile, took those stories and amplified them in Fox's Book of Martyrs, a bestseller of its time, endorsed by Queen Elizabeth I herself. His portraits of Protestant martyrs framed Mary as a bloodthirsty tyrant. The term Bloody Mary was born not from the facts alone but from propaganda, with the aim of ensuring no Catholic monarch would ever return to England's throne. But consider this: Henry VIII executed tens of thousands during his reign. Elizabeth I, often hailed as one of England's greatest rulers, executed hundreds of Catholics, many of them priests, tortured and killed for nothing more than saying Mass. Yet history gave them grandeur, statues, gold-inked titles. Only Mary was branded bloody. Why? Because Mary didn't leave a legacy, she left a vacuum. She had no child, no heir to carry on her vision, no wave of reforms that stood the test of time. Her brief 5-year reign ended in disappointment, military humiliation with the loss of Calais, and deep national division. And because she was a woman. Women in power were always judged more harshly, their emotions labeled as hysteria, their convictions as fanaticism. Mary was mocked for her false pregnancies, now likely understood as phantom pregnancies, triggered by immense psychological pressure or a uterine illness. She was ridiculed for her heartbreak, her devotion to a husband who abandoned her, and even in death she was overshadowed, buried in Westminster Abbey beneath the effigy of her sister Elizabeth, whose name alone dominates their shared tomb. Elizabeth understood image in a way Mary never could. Where Mary ruled with conviction, Elizabeth ruled with pageantry. She became the Virgin Queen, the Golden Age monarch, and to secure that image she allowed the myth of Mary to harden, to fester. And so Mary became the boogeyman of English history. Her story bled into folklore. She became a ghost in the mirror, a figure of horror in playground games, a name invoked to scare children, and with each generation the real Mary slipped further into shadow. But she wasn't a monster. She was a deeply religious woman who believed with all her heart that she was saving England. She was a queen raised in trauma, ruling in a time of chaos. She made terrible decisions, yes. The burnings were inexcusable by any standard. But she was not unique in her brutality. She was not mad, not bloodthirsty for the sake of it. She was trying to survive, to restore, to believe. And in that struggle she lost everything. But perhaps what makes Mary most human and most tragic isn't what she did, but how history remembered her. She has no monument, no golden age, no empire or Shakespeare or Armada to speak for her. Only a mirror, a name, a myth. And maybe it's time to rewrite that. Because the real Bloody Mary wasn't a ghost or a ghoul. She was England's first queen to rule in her own right. A woman who endured betrayal, humiliation, and heartbreak and still wore a crown. We don't have to absolve her, but we do owe her the truth.